The election for the US president is highly unusual. It consists of, I would describe as 3 different stages. There's the pre-election stage where people are jockeying for support. They're jockeying to raise money so that they can run a campaign. When they decide to raise money, they have to file with the Federal Election Commission. And then there's a second stage, which is the nomination stage. So you, as an individual, need to run within your party and be nominated by your party. This is another complicated process because it occurs in all 50 states. Each state has an opportunity to conduct their own primary or their own caucus. A caucus is a unique set of meetings where you show your support for a specific candidate who's running for the presidency. It's a multi-stage process. It takes a lot of time. Primaries are far more common in the United States, where you simply go and vote as though you would vote for any election. Once you win the nomination of your party, we're in the 3rd stage of the election, which is called the general election. And that's when the nominee from the Republican Party faces off against the nominee of the Democratic Party. There are occasions where we have a 3rd party candidate, or what we call a minor party candidate. Generally speaking, those candidates never win, but they can splinter votes away from one party or the other. So the occurrence of a 3rd party candidate can oftentimes be an advantage for a candidate, advantage or disadvantage, depending on which party they draw from. Minor party candidates in the United States rarely get more than 5% of the vote. There's the example of Ross Perot, who I believe got 19% of the vote, or that was the highest percentage, 3rd party percentage of the general election vote in this country. But generally speaking, minor party candidates are there to publicize an issue. They're hoping that one of the major parties will co-opt their issue and go from there. So in the general election, you typically have a Republican and a Democrat facing off of each other. You have election day where everybody shows up and votes. Through the night, you have the announcements of the results from each different state. But then we have this unique feature of an electoral college. So it's not the grand total of votes that matters. It's what happens within each state. And so, for instance, in the case of Ohio, if Ohio votes for President Bush gets all of the electoral votes. And the electoral votes are based on the size of the congressional delegation in a state plus 2 senators. So it obviously, the larger the population of a state, the more electoral votes they have. States like Texas, California, New York State, because such large populations, they will have lots of electoral votes.
Presidential elections have become more visual. They have become something that is put in front of every American in a way that oftentimes Americans can't avoid, even when they want to avoid it. As technology has allowed presidents to campaign on the radio, on television, via mail, and in a continuous way, presidential elections have engaged the public in a way in which they never had before. Previously, nominees were chosen by party bosses. Oftentimes, early on in the Republic, presidents campaigned from their front porch, from home. They didn't go out on the campaign trail in the way that we think of presidents doing so now. It was remarkable for someone like Harry Truman to take a train through towns and have a whistle-stop tour where he gave a speech in one town from the back of the train, and then the train pulled out and went to another town. That was really active campaigning in an almost unprecedented way. Now, presidential candidates are in multiple states every day, raising money, talking to voters, holding rallies, and that has engaged the public in a way that's quite positive. It has motivated people to pay more attention to who they're selecting as president, and it really starts to, in some ways, break down the Electoral College, where even though people go into their voting booth and they're casting ballot for the electors of a certain presidential candidate, they're really voting for president.
So it's a multi-stage process to be elected presidency in the United States. It's a very expensive process. And the Electoral College, the existence of the Electoral College, which I would argue is one of the more elitist features of the US Constitution. And it's elitist because at the time, the founders were a little bit concerned about people's ability to know really what they were doing when it came to voting. So instead of just allowing grand totals of votes, what you do is you have the Electoral College meet. And more often than not, they cast their votes in favor of whatever the popular vote was in that particular state. But they have the right not to. So the idea at the time of the founding was that these electors will restore some sense. They won't be overwhelmed by the passions of a particularly flashy candidate. Instead, what they'll do is they will, vote in the true interests of the country. Fortunately for the history of the United States, more often than not, these electors have held true to whatever the state results are. But because each state has a differing number of electoral votes, it means that some states are going to be ignored. States like South Dakota, North Dakota, less populous states have 3 electoral votes. So if you're a candidate and you're worried about funding and you have a limited time to travel and campaign on behalf of your presidency, you're not going to spend time in small states. It's just not worth it. And even large states, if those large states tend to be predominantly Democratic or predominantly Republican, it has a huge impact on your strategy, because if you're George Bush, you're not going to campaign in Texas. He's from Texas. It's largely a Republican state. There's really no reason to spend any time there. So what happens with the Electoral College is it really puts a premium on swing states. And by swing states, I mean those states that are popularly contested that contain roughly a 50-50 percentage of Republicans and Democrats. States like Ohio, states like Florida, states like Colorado, those are swing states. And if you look at an analysis of where candidates spend their time, they spend a disproportionate share of their time in these swing states so that they can win on Election Day.
It has moved from a very closed, hierarchical process to one that is now extraordinarily porous and open. Some say overly democratic, that a lot of the dignity of the process has been wrung out of it by the necessity to make an appeal directly to the people. There was a term for that in the Federalist Papers. It was considered demagoguery to make an appeal directly to people, and the framers took a dim view of that. They felt that that was beneath the dignity of the kind of politics that they wanted to see done, and there's a lot of theorizing about whether we might not do better with some alternative form. But the fact is that we become a more democratic population, again, small d, more popular in form, and our presidential candidates are more popular in form. They have to be able to make a direct connection to the American people to be successful.
So the process has changed. There are far fewer caucuses than there used to be. There obviously are still some, but not nearly as many as there used to be. And I think the primaries allow for more people to participate. There are some states, though, that have closed primaries, meaning that you can only vote in the primary if you're a member of that party. So if it's a Republican primary, you can only participate if you're a Republican. Most states have open primaries, which means you can participate regardless of your party affiliation. So there have been some changes over time that are positive. They realize it's important for people to be a part of the process. And so in order, determining who the party's nominee is essential. And you want to encourage people to vote. But if you look at participation in the nomination phase, on average, it hovers around 30%. So that means that roughly 30% of the electorate are determining who the nominees will be. And then if you look at general election participation, that hovers in the mid-50s. So, there's a lot of people in America that need to vote. And there's a lot more that can be done to encourage people to vote.